Hello, so I'm going to make a video about whether or not God exists, and I'm probably not going to come to a definitive answer, but I'm going to talk through a theory that I heard the other day, and it was sort of by Jordan Peterson, and then I ended up having like a little bit of a weird experience as well, a couple of days ago, um, yeah, which sort of like changed my belief a little bit, but in a certain direction. So I sort of had this idea. Well, I sort of heard this idea, and I think it's a good idea, that God doesn't have to exist outside of ourselves. So God doesn't have to be this objective being which exists in the external world. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't exist, because you can argue that things like love and happiness and sadness, they don't exist outside of ourselves, but they still have a psychological and physiological significance. Okay, so just because, but then again, you can argue that those things, those emotions are scientifically testable. I feel like I'm talking loud in my head. Um, yeah, so, but anyway, the point I want to put forward is the idea that perhaps God exists as some sort of pragmatic truth. Like the idea of God has pragmatic value. And this pragmatic value is sort of like, um, when we believe in God, or when we follow a religion, but I don't know. I don't feel comfortable saying that. I'll just say when we believe in God, we sort of have an axiom to predicate our lives around, because it's hard to find meaning in a world whereby anything could be classed as meaningful. But see, I don't know, because can we have meaning without God? And maybe we can, but it's not an objective meaning. And is it even an objective meaning if God only exists within our head? Um, I don't know. But anyway, the idea that I had was that maybe religion isn't an axiomatic foundation which holds society together. Rather, it's an axiomatic foundation which holds the individual together. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's more important than having an axiomatic foundation which holds society together. Because if the individual can not become fragmented, then that's going to in turn make society not become fragmented. Um, and I guess it's sort of like, well, I don't know, because religion, you could argue, is quite a collectivist thing, and it's like, well, why would it need to be collectivist if the sole purpose of God is just to be some sort of pragmatic thing which helps the individual function within reality and establish some truth, which may or may not be true, but it is true to the degree that it is practical, in that it can make an individual's life better than maybe not believing in that God, because it's a certain foundation almost. Um, can't remember where I was a minute ago. I went off on a little bit of tangent then. Well, in like 5 seconds or something, 5 seconds ago. So God. Okay, so I said God. The idea of God is an axiomatic foundation which holds the individual together rather than one which holds society together. And that's an important thing because, well, the individual sort of has to be held together. And when I'm basing this on my own anecdotal experience, subjectively, because when I don't believe in God, it's weird because it sounds like I go in and out of belief quite a lot, but I don't. When I didn't believe in God, which also sounds like I do now, but I'm not so sure about that. When I didn't believe in God, I'll leave it at that. I often found myself getting extremely nihilistic and feeling like there's no point to life. And that's something that I genuinely believed. I didn't think that there was any point to anything, and I would often find myself feeling like there is no truth, and that was a problem. It was a pragmatic problem in that it inhibited my daily routine and it inhibited me from progressing forward. So perhaps the belief in God stops that from happening. It stops you from becoming so fragmented and nihilistic and uncertain, and that allows you to exceed more in other areas of life. And maybe this isn't the case for everybody. Maybe some people are just able to establish a common goal in their lives which they're able to work towards, and that's fine. But, that still doesn't rule out the possibility of God existing. I don't know. So I think if God exists on a pragmatic level in the individual, then why do people tend to have the idea that this God exists outside of ourselves? And I think that people do that because we don't just see God as a moral agent. We don't just see him as something which helps us necessarily. We see him as something which perhaps created the universe or acts in the universe in a certain way, acts through nature or acts outside of ourselves. And I don't want to make any big assumptions here, but perhaps you can't really not make big assumptions when you're talking about something metaphysical, but I don't... Okay, so... I lost my thought train again. So the belief in God existing outside of ourselves, even though God could just exist pragmatically, actually allows that pragmatic belief to be stronger than it would if we just thought we were believing it as a subjective truth. Rather, we have to believe it as an objective truth in order for that belief to have some sort of strong foundation within us. So, and then that's where religious collectivism comes in, or when you see the communal side of religion. Like if you've got multiple people sharing an experience, then you're much more likely to hold on to that belief in God, rather than if you were just the only individual in the world who believed in God. And then would you even believe in God if you were the only individual in the world who believed in God? I don't know, because then would there even be a God? It would just be something that you believed in yourself. And I don't know if it makes sense to say that religion's just a mass... Well, I think Freud called it a universal obsessional neuroses, which is essentially just a mental illness. But is that a bit reductionist? I don't deny the fact that religion has done some reprehensible things throughout history, but can we really just pin that down to religion, or is that just a reflection of human nature? One thing that comes to mind is socialists criticizing capitalism. It's is it really capitalism that's bad, or is capitalism just an embodiment of human nature, of an inevitable part of human nature, such as greed and individualism? I think that's possible. So it's not necessarily the case that capitalism breeds these things, it's just that capitalism embodies these things. But I'll try not to go too far down the line of politics. So, but anyway, I think you can sort of get my point. It's the same with religion. Religion doesn't create evil. It's more like religion embodies the evil which already exists within humanity, because religion is essentially a human construction, whatever that may mean. But that doesn't mean that just because it's a human construction, it doesn't make it arbitrary. It doesn't mean it doesn't point to anything beyond itself. And I also think that a lot of the stories within religion hold a lot of significance as well. And I think Carl Jung really touches on this nicely, but I don't know enough about it to be able to explain it well. But he talks of the archetypes, and he says that these are sort of like ideals, and that these are captured within religious stories, but not only within religious stories. We also seem to be able to capture them in modern media, and that's what makes a good book or a good film. It's because we can witness something being acted out. We can witness a specific moral code or ethic being acted out over time So some common archetypes are the archetypal hero. So I think a good one for this is Harry Potter. It's like a hero who has to go on a journey, and then he has to. Well, he starts off quite naive because he's a child. He realizes he's a wizard, so he's got like this sort of this talent, this power that not many people possess. And then so then he has to go into the unknown, which is like the castle, Hogwarts, and along the way he ends up having to go and slay massive snakes and until the end when he finally defeats Voldemort and he comes out triumphant. And it's like you've seen him go along this journey from being this little boy to coming out as like this like strong man who can actually, I don't know, stand up for himself in the world, and who's faced evil and who has brought good about. And that's one of the archetypal stories, I guess. It's what Harry Potter embodies, that archetype of the hero, but obviously there's other archetypes within that as well. 1 minute. Right, my sister came down, so yeah, paused it. Okay, so I've just talked about the hero archetype, and I think we can explore a little bit of how the archetypes are actually transmitted down the generations and where they exist. And I think that they exist, that they're transmitted both psychologically, biologically, and culturally. So it's like they're a necessary condition to they're necessary to be acted out within the world. Like they have to be acted out in the world. Or at least the good ones, because they're like the ideals. So if you can sort of embody the archetype, then you're acting in the ideal manner almost. But they're transmitted through stories, and it's like, well, if we can collect archetypes within new media sources such as films, then why do we need to keep the religious stories which the archetypes may also be embedded in? And I don't know, like, do we? And it's like, well, these are like some of the oldest stories, I guess, so maybe it's not a bad idea to do that. And I guess it could go back to the idea that, like, having God as, like, the belief in God having pragmatic purpose. If we keep the religious scripture, then we keep the belief in God going. Therefore, it does have some sort of survival purpose. Like, I mean, if we can keep, because the idea of God is closely linked to the Bible within Christianity anyway. I'll leave out other religions for now, but God is essentially at the center of the Christian religion. So, and then this God was then embodied with Christ. So the Bible almost provides a narrative to go alongside this belief in God, which presumably does have some sort of pragmatic purpose for providing an axiomatic foundation for the individual. So if that's the case, and then you've got a narrative to go alongside this, it's almost like a concrete foundation for what you're believing in, to live a better life. And I think you do come back to the case of like, well, can you live a good life without belief in God? And then we've got to question that as well, because would there be morality without God? Like, would there be good and would there be bad? And I don't know, because I think I've heard the secular humanist case for this, where it's basically like, well, whatever promotes well-being is good. And because you can link this to utilitarianism, that which promotes the most well-being for the most people, or the most happiness and pleasure for the most people is good. But, you know, I don't know what makes pleasure good and what makes pain bad. Like, the fact that those moral terms even exist, does that suggest that there's perhaps an external moral agent determining that? And I don't know, because then that contradicts what I was saying about the belief in God just being pragmatic. So maybe God does actually exist. But then again, is that a leap of faith? But then you could argue, well, is that leap of faith necessary? Because I guess we do take leaps of faith every day, but just some we have more evidence for than others. Like, I don't think there is insufficient evidence for belief in God. I think you've got a lot of arguments which look at the world, so inductive arguments, a posteriori, such as the teleological and the cosmological argument, the cosmological argument basically says that everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause, and that's essentially what that argument is predicated on. So it's a logical argument, and it was influenced by Aristotle and developed by Aquinas. And the teleological argument, which is the design argument, which is the complexity of the universe essentially implies design. And I know that you can take a scientific standpoint on this and say, well, evolution is what has caused the world to get to this point today. It's not that God designed the perfect eye, but then again, you can argue that perhaps God put the building blocks for life in place. And I know that a lot of the ancient Greek philosophers, they believed that the building blocks for life, or matter, pre-existed, and that some sort of God brought it into being. Like, I think Plato called God the demiurge, and he basically just brought matter into being. Well, no, he didn't bring matter into being. He reordered existing matter based on his knowledge of the realm of the forms, or direct experience of the realm of the forms, and that's why. So the world does encapsulate the forms in a way, in quite a close way to what the actual forms are, but it's not the actual forms because it's just mere copies, because the forms aren't physical. My cat just came in. She hasn't been very well for a few days. Yeah, I'm better now though. Yeah, so I don't think we do have insufficient evidence for belief in God. Like, it's not certain, but then again, nothing really is certain, and I think that when you're talking about God or religion, I don't think we should be so quick to discredit it as complete and utter bullshit, because I don't think that's the case, because of how universal it is, and we shouldn't assume that it serves no purpose whatsoever, and the purpose that it does serve, we shouldn't assume that we know what that is necessarily, and due to us perhaps not knowing the purpose of religion, in the context of society or the individual, then we shouldn't be so quick to get rid of it, because we don't know what the consequences of getting rid of it will be. And, well, Nietzsche talked about his predictions of the death of God as a result of us actually killing him because of the reprehensible things that we've done in the name of religion. The consequences of the death of God would be nihilism, genocide, and totalitarianism, which is essentially exactly what happened in the 20th century, and that was, I think it's half a century after Nietzsche had died. So he was essentially a prophet in that sense. But yeah, so I don't think we have insufficient evidence for the belief in God. I think there's a perfect case to be made. I'm not sure if God exists objectively, but I think that's definitely a possibility as well. I think God definitely has the belief in God definitely has a pragmatic purpose. And then you can obviously make the case for the belief in God as actually being some sort of external being, but then even still, it's weird, because it's like God's not physical, so technically it doesn't. You can't imagine God being a being which exists made out of matter. You've got to sort of imagine him existing but not taking up space. So I think this gets pretty close to my sort of idea of God. Like I guess we could think of God as one of as a platonic form, and I know that the sun in Plato's cave story is actually could be interpreted as being symbolic of God, because it's the highest form of the good. It's like the ultimate form. So yeah, my phone's gonna die in like 5%. Yeah, so we can interpret the form of the good in Plato's cave allegory as God, as the Christian God, and Plato has actually been described as one of the precursors to Christian thinking. I think it's interesting how a religion wasn't actually built around Plato per se, but Plato then influenced Christianity. It's like, well, why wasn't Socrates the son of God? Why wasn't Plato the son of God? And it's like, no, it was this guy called Jesus who came down to help people and was quite a liberator. Like Socrates, he was, I guess, a skeptic. He just got everyone to question the norm. It's like, which is sort of what Jesus did. And then Plato, he came up with this whole metaphysical idea of this realm whereby the whole world was copied from. And then but then Jesus, who comes around like centuries after, it's like he was sort of like Socrates in that he did question the status quo, but he did it in a different sort of way. He didn't overtly go out there like a gadfly like Socrates was labelled as, and force people um to rethink the way that they currently thought. He did it more covertly almost through stories, and I think it was the means in which he did it that made him so important. And he also focused on action, which I think was quite interesting. But yeah, I haven't really got enough time to be speculating about Jesus right now because I'm on 4%. But yeah, does God exist? I'm gonna say yes. That's what I'm gonna say. And you can have all your ideas about what God means, okay? But when you go out there and criticize God, do you really know what you're criticizing? Because I doubt it. I think a lot of atheists, they like to create a straw man out of religion, which is understandable because religion has done some abhorrent things in the past and still does some abhorrent things today. But I don't think just because there's bad aspects to something, we should criticize the whole of it. Like politics, there's a lot of bad things going on in politics at the minute, but it doesn't mean that the whole of politics is corrupt and needs to be abolished. Like I don't believe that at all. Um, I've just reminded myself of something. There was a Hegelian term, is that how you say it? Hegelian. Well, one of Hegel's words, which was, I'm not gonna be able to remember. It begins with an S. No, I can't remember it. But anyway, it means that you shouldn't just chuck out the whole of something. You should carry across the good bits and let go of the bad bits to implement the good parts into a new system. And perhaps that's the case. Anyway, I'm gonna have to go because my phone's about to die. Um, yeah, but don't think you know exactly people what people are worshipping when they say they worship God, because you probably don't know. God's an extremely complex thing, and so is religion, and I don't know. It's just, yeah, just keeping up on mind, I guess. Right, thanks for watching.